You're listening to the Outsider Art and Occult podcast, Pragmagick. I'm your host, Keats Ross. This episode, we leave the woo-woo for the weird, well, the wonderful of what could be considered an outsider artist, by which I mean someone who has created and conjured wonderful works of art far outside the confines of scenes, streams, or currents. Allow me to gush for a moment. I have been a fan of John Schmersal's for the better part of my life. Whether it was his angular guitar shapes in his early band Brainiac, or his approach to songwriting and production in his later groups like John Stuart Mill, Enon, Vertical Scratchers, and Crooks on tape. John is a paragon, a conduit of crooked clamor and mutant melody, and I hold him in the highest regard as a creator. That aside, it was nice to get the scoops on how his littler-known masterpieces were created. You know, the ones like his Masonic temple-recorded solo project, John Stuart Mill, or the midwifing of his frontmanship with Enon's Believo. Both records were birthed simultaneously in the wake of the tragic death of Brainiac's brilliant Swashbuckler frontman, Tim. And both are major touchstones for my own sonic experimentation and outsider music since high school. Hell, I even named my high school band Believo in tribute to his work. There's a new Brainiac documentary making the festival rounds that answers the long gestating questions about the Brainiac folklore that warrants a hunt and a watch. This documentary seems to have already resurrected the fun and fervor of the Brainiac legend with rare reunion shows and stars like Fred Armisen lending his accolades. I feel proud that they are finally getting some long-deserved shine. Though past is simply prologue to John and his prolific career post-Brainiac and even Enon, as John has created some of the most inventive, incendiary music since. He's created the irreverent rock of the Vertical Scratchers, the improvisational Enon torchbearers that are Crooks on tape. He tours with the wonderful Caribou, produces records, and gave this longtime fan over 3 hours of his wonderful time to chat about all of the above. The following has been edited down for time, but you can hear the full 3.5-hour conversation via our Patreon at patreon.com/WeTheHallowed. So slither hither, weirdos and witches. Here's my conversation with John Schmersal. John Schmersal, it is such an honor to talk to you. I've been a fan of yours for so long, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And please, thank you for rescheduling a lot.
Oh, no problem. I'm sorry that it was such a process to get to this point.
Oh, it'll be worth it, I promise. So it's pretty, I don't know, it's kind of prescient that I get you on the phone now, considering I started my love for your music and my kind of fandom with your work in Brainiac, and with the new documentary that's out. And I thought we could start with maybe the genealogy around what got you guitar playing in Brainiac.
Well, the Dayton music scene really wasn't that big, and so when I was in high school, I played in a few different bands. Me and Tyler, the drummer in Brainiac, played in a band in high school. with just, our high school, some close friends. And the outgrowing of that, later, me and one of the other guys played in a band with kind of our local, hardcore hero called Haunting Souls. And that band, the guitar player in that band Nate Farley went on to play in Guided by Voices and Tanning the Amps, sort of the Breeders kind of in-between named thing. Eventually just became the Breeders again with kind of a changing lineup. But anyway, so at the time when me and this guy, Jeremy Frederick, were playing, at first it was a band that I sang in with Tyler playing drums. It was a hardcore band, and I just kind of sang or screamed. And eventually I was playing bass in this incarnation of Haunting Souls. And the basement that we practiced in was in the house that Jamie and Tim Taylor lived in. At the time, Timmy had this band with Juan called the Whiz Bangs. Uh-huh. So, we all just saw each other around. The Whiz Bangs were a totally different kind of thing. It was more of sweet, kind of more 70s, more glam than punk per se. And eventually that stuff morphed into what became Brainiac. By the time I went to college, they tried out Tyler. And even though I wasn't known for playing guitar in any of the bands, I sang in one and I played bass, which was really my first instrument. I was obsessed with learning to play any instrument. I bought, whenever I could find anything that was cheap enough, I would buy it. So basically between Tim, and at that point he was hanging out with my friend Jeremy, who I had been in both of those bands in high school with. And I think he suggested me, much as he also kind of wanted to fill the shoes, I think I seemed maybe to be more grounded. So Tim actually wrote me a letter and invited me, and I'm sure Tyler corroborated that, he would love to have me in the band. So like I said, the scene wasn't that big. At the time, I was constantly experimenting with tunings, and my thing about playing in alternate tunings was more to confuse me and train my ear. It was more of a way to use those shapes and to make new shapes for different kinds of chords, and to sort of get out of the box, that kind of stuff. And more than anything, I think that I did a good job of training my ear and maybe confusing myself, but I wasn't playing in a set tuning per se. So the best part for me about joining Brainiac was that it was exciting to really embrace a band that was so great, that was local, that I also knew all the members. But also that Timmy had already, created a palette of tunings that he was already using. And so I just basically came in and was like, oh, I get this. This feels really good. And we just hit the ground running.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love you considering musically in a visual way, or at least approaching instrumentation like guitar, because I hear that. Like, there's a through line with your guitar playing, from Brainiac to Vertical Scratchers that is very much your own. And I've never heard anyone kind of come close. I used to jokingly remark that it sounded like Mark Ribot, like a punk rock Mark Ribot. Like these really fascinating kind of atonal structures where it's like a sinew for the entire song. Like really, really fascinating stuff. And
thank you.
Yeah, to hear you talk about it in a visual aspect is super interesting. And did you approach? Is this where your love, like you were saying, for cheap instruments, your love for the Tisco guitars and all that kind of came through?
Well, mentioning the love for Tesco guitars, when I joined the band, I was going to college at Ohio University, and I was about 2 years in, and just about I was supposed to be getting into whatever my core thing was, which I chose audio engineering. What I really wanted to be doing was playing music. And the summer before that year, I was working 2 jobs to save for the school year. And I ended up going to, there were a few great music shops in the Cleveland area where my parents lived. And there was also this guy who went to trade shows, which were pretty popular at the time. And so he was always getting new stuff in. And I blew a considerable amount of the money that I was basically making and saving for that next year on a lot of the core things that I ended up using joining the band by wintertime. So, I didn't know it, went for it, and it worked out. I won't say it was intuition. I won't say that I knew that I was going to join this band, but it kind of fulfilled its destiny for me. When I joined the band, there weren't that many new songs, but we were just kind of like, I joined and there was already a tour to be rehearsing for. So I joined, we practiced for the tour, kind of like there were a couple of new things on the table, but by the time that tour was finished, it was like we needed to make a record. And the longevity of a band of guys in their 20s, it was a long time after the first record, and they had done a considerable amount of touring on that record. So Bonsai Superstar happened really pretty quickly. There were demos for things, but it came together quite quickly, so much that I feel like we had a certain level of uncertainty of digesting as it was happening, whereas Hissing Prigs was a lot more polished in that there were demos for all the songs, and we were like ready to go into the studio when we went in, and I think that shows. We were definitely like a fully formed band where we knew our strengths and our weaknesses. And I always remember Tim, I didn't really ever think about this kind of stuff when I wrote things. Tim would think about the way Tyler played drums when he would think about writing a song. And so he would kind of write for his kind of manic style of drum playing, which I think is really an interesting thing to consider.
I mean, it's just one of my favorite. It was so influential for me as a young, musician, songwriter too, especially one who played in bands. Like there was something so sinister but somewhat comical to it. There was it was fun. That's
the thing that I loved about Brainiac before I was in the band. I really loved bands I loved Bad Brains. And I loved the Dead Kennedys when I was in high school, and I loved the Dead Milkmen. And there was a certain cartoonness to the music where, it was punk and it was angry, but there was still a sense of humor. Bad Brains and Dead Kennedys played so fast that it almost didn't seem possible. And and the singing was so crazy. And so that's kind of what I felt about Brainiac. When they played live, it was way faster than on the record. It was kind of unbelievable what you were hearing. It didn't sound real. It didn't sound like something people were playing. It sounded like something someone had manufactured for you to make believe. So I was very in tune with that. Those were the things those were where I came from as a listener. And the band that we had in high school was also a bit like that. It was punk, but we definitely had a sense of humor about it. I always tried to be both approachable and emotional and a little scary too.
Chaotic.
I really liked bands like the Cows back then. There aren't really bands like that anymore that are so you can't really tell if it's funny, but you're also a little bit scared when you're at the show. You don't know what's going to happen.
I was going to bring up that there's a tether. That thread with all of your music that does have that levity to it. And I remember reading, we'll get to Believo in a little bit because I got a lot to say about that record. But there was, I remember reading reviews of it being called cartoon noir, or you know what I mean? It was always picked up on this kind of this humorous chaos in it. Even though I think the word cartoon doesn't do it any service, but I could see why people pick up on the humor like that. Well, I was wondering if you could paint a picture to me around that time, because pretty soon, not directly soon, but your next project, John Stuart Mill, is a record that I have relentlessly listened to, has been super influential to me as just a solo one-man band, engineer, performer throughout the years. And I always wanted to know what the gestation of that record was, like where you were in life, and especially after something as pivotal as Tim Taylor passing away.
It's a mixture of things. So I was talking to you about, where I was when I joined Brainiac, and I was using a lot of tunings, and I was collecting instruments. I would buy guitars at thrift stores, acoustic and electric.
Right.
And I got into Ornette Coleman, Fred Frith, Mark Rebo, a lot of experimental guitar playing. And I just wanted to be able to create a palette. Really, like, the catalyst of using a 4-track was just not everyone could afford a reel-to-reel or learn how to use one. And the distortion on a cassette 4-track when you overdrive a track is pretty forgiving. Before I was in Brainiac, as far as like building a palette of weird acoustic guitars that just had an interesting kind of tonality to them in spaces and putting them in weird tunings and, kind of just the way that those guitars sounded and felt. I always felt like guitars, even cheap ones, had a really almost like a life of their own. They would inspire things that kind of,
yeah.
I mean, it wasn't until like the last 10 years that I actually started trying to acquire guitars that actually played well, which is a ridiculous thing to say because, I mean, I kind of often bought guitars because I liked the way that they looked, either aesthetically or just the way that the neck felt in my hands. And a lot of times those ended up being Japanese guitars or, cheap British guitars or cheap families of Dan Electro Silvertone style guitars. I guess what I was saying is when I was in Athens, there was a big community of people who made kind of like bastardized folk music and self-recorded. And when I got into Brainiac, I got centered, but also a bit out of that. And at the time when we were doing Hissing Prigs, I was really, really super into what we were doing there. And part of what I liked about getting into sampling and sort of away from the Moog was I kind of felt like I was starting to hit a wall with the things that I was doing in Brainiac as a guitar player. I wanted to do either newer things or newer things to me, and whether that meant doing it in different tunings or just figuring out like a kind of different way of playing, or maybe I just needed some new gadgets to add into the mix, because one of the things that I was pretty steadfast up until then was not using effects for the guitar playing. I barely used effects. I always kind of thought the tone knob on a guitar was kind of overrated. Like, you can roll off the tone, which I do when I play bass. I like to roll all the tone off, so it's kind of wolfy sounding. But for guitar, I feel like some of them I would have the guitar tech just jack the electronics, so it was maybe the volume knob worked, but sometimes it was just the pickup wired straight to the jack, because it's the simplest connection is the strongest connection. And so you're going to get the cleanest tone available in that way. And then I would plug into my amp, and I loved the way that my amp sounded. It was a tube overdrive section and a solid state master. So it was kind of the best of both worlds, and I always liked the way that sounded. So anyway, kind of experimenting also at the same time with self-recording, stuff at home. And then by the time Timmy passed, I was living in Newport, Kentucky, in the second floor of what was the Masonic Temple of Newport. And it had really high ceilings, and it had a really interesting tone. And so I kind of spent a lot of time recording in there as sort of like self-therapy after Tim passed. And basically that process, it was a before, a middle, and then I finished that record in New York. I moved there during that following summer. So it's a bit of a moving piece in progress. It was recorded in a bunch of different rooms, so there's different acoustic sounds,
right,
and also some direct input stuff, which sounds very more intimate, I guess.
I mean, yeah, it's a beautiful record. It was always very haunting for me, and I didn't really know at the time or understand kind of all the, the backstory with Tim Taylor so much. It was just I kind of stumbled onto it looking for what the Brainiac people were up to after,
Well, I'm glad you did. Part of my sort of journey through that experience was when I arrived in New York, and I kind of started Enon simultaneously.
Yeah.
But the Dave Sardi, who started the label that both records came out on, when the John Stuart Mill thing was happening, I didn't really. One of the reasons why I named it John Stuart Mill and not myself or whatever was was my way of not taking responsibility for it, because I didn't feel like myself, partly through the process of making that. It was like I just had to go to a different place and work through those things.
Place
it was
like,
important.
Was it just a heavily creative kind of annexed time?
I don't know. I think that's sort of the mystery of creating things.
Right.
Like there was. I did a few different things. I was making that record, and I also had this Paya kit for a synthesizer that I was soldering together, and I was smoking a lot of pot, and I was doing a very bad job of putting together that synthesizer, by the way. I was not very good at soldering, and I didn't have a very good soldering iron, and some of the components got heated up a little more than they should have while I was trying to put the thing together. Mm-hmm. So anyway, you do things to move through that area. I remember after Tim died, deciding there was a show that was happening in town, and I purposefully went to the show, not because I was excited to see the music, but because I knew there would be a lot of people there, and I knew that they could tell me that they were sorry, and we could talk. We could work through that part, and I could do it kind of more or less all at once in a weird way.
Yeah.
It was for me healthier to kind of just engage with that in a cathartic way versus, kind of just running into people, willy-nilly or something like that.
Yeah, what better way? Just diving back in, working through it. Refresh the anchor, as you say, right?
Exactly. By the time that was becoming something outside of my brain, and a label was going to put it out and it was going to become a product, I had a really hard time dealing with it because, then they were like, well, are you going to, you got to take press pictures, and when are you going to start, are you playing shows? Have you played any shows? And I was like, oh man, I don't think I want to be that guy on a nightly level. I don't want to go places and rehearse this music and play it out. It didn't feel good on a level because music that is melancholy or of that nature. It was good for me to work through it, but I didn't feel like I wanted to relive that every night. The process for me was about making it. And so I kind of came to a realization, and I was like, you know what? That's when Enon was starting, and Enon was sort of like the continuation of all of those things I was talking about in Brainiac.
Oh, yeah.
I was happy to be doing something with like-minded people. Rick Lee, who became kind of my new musical songwriting partner.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that band.
And if I hadn't had that going on simultaneously, I think it would have been I think the label would have been very angry with me, basically, because it was their first release, and so they kind of used it as a guinea pig to figure out how to, put things out. And it was 1999, so
right.
Digital downloading was one of the first years of that actually happening. So they're figuring out how the distro got counted for those things, and things getting advertised on the web versus also in print. And so there was an interesting process, but for me, it was kind of like, okay, I definitely like playing in a band more, and I definitely realized that people who make records expect you to promote them.
Right.
So, you have to deal with that aspect of it. And I realized, like, okay, it was cool making that record, but also continuing as a guitar player. I used that guitar tuning a little bit, but I really wanted to get away from the typical shapes, sounds, and movements that I did in Brainiac. I was already kind of feeling like I had done a lot of the things within those grounds that I wanted to do, and it was actually an opportunity to do something which seemed radical for me, which was playing in standard tuning every once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
So that also happened.
Let's dive in, because enter Believo, right? So this record, I think I've told you a couple of times, I actually saw Enon play at Berkeley years ago, and I remember coming up to you after and was like, hey, I'm the kid that started his high school band and called it Believo.
Oh, yeah, right. We did talk about this.
Yeah, so this record meant a lot as far as just, it's just one son of a bitch of a record. It's so good, and it's so sinister, and just there's something so dark and beautiful about it, and Matters Gray was the first song I heard from it, and that's kind of what pulled me in. And that song in and of itself, to me, is like an entirely different genre or idea of music.
Wow.
Yeah. But let's talk about the creation of that record. Like, I've always wanted to know, now that I know that you were doing it in conjunction with John Stuart Mill, which makes perfect sense, because they're antithetical in a lot of ways, but I do see the through line.
I liked playing the supporting role in Brainiac. I wasn't ready to be a singer when I was in that band, or like the kind of a guitar playing frontman, even though I sang in a band before. At that point, I kind of started to figure it out, I felt like, and Rick Lee and I just worked so well together. When I moved to New York, we started playing together immediately, and we just had a gazillion ideas. I had this closet-sized studio in my apartment, which was above the staircase, and we banged out so much crazy stuff that ended up on the first two instrumental releases and Believo in such a short time period. He and I were
this was in the Masonic place too?
No. I had the sampler. Basically, all my Brainiac stuff was in Dayton.
Right.
And
yeah, you were saying, yeah.
Yeah, I moved from Dayton to Cincinnati and then to Newport. And by the time I got to Newport, the sampler we had, which was a PV sampler, there was 2 rack spaces. Mm-hmm. And I inherited that when Brainiac ended, and so I had that. Rick Lee was more a proprietor of battery-powered, smaller, Roland-based and Japanese samplers, battery-powered stuff that he could fit in the suitcases. And that's where the suitcase penchant started.
Yeah.
I got really into using this Alesis MMT8 sequencer, and I would sequence either MIDI synthesizers through it or the this PV sampler, which just my favorite thing to do. I would spend hours and hours creating a really intricate program for a sample bank, and then you just change banks to a random bank that you would create something else, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is way better than the thing I spent 2 days creating, using rhythmic MIDI information and reprocessing it into banks that you were unintentionally using for more sometimes it was comic relief, and sometimes it just made sense as far as a change in a song or.
Right. I was just wondering how hard it was to kind of translate that to playing live around that time.
Me and Rick were kind of a similar mindset where we were not really thinking at all about, sort of in a similar way that the John Stuart Mill thing, I was working through it, but it was the luxury of not anticipating how you were going to do things live, or if you were going to do them live. We weren't trying to play live. All we were doing was trying to create stuff in a tiny room on headphones or through a little amp. So we were just constantly, that in a way, I don't know if you know the Crooks on Tape, his and my new band.
Yeah.
But when I think about what we do now, it's in a way very, very, it's just a total growth of that first bit when he and I were in that like little closet space studio I had. We were just like basically recording ourselves live, improvising with samplers and synthesizers. And we were, thankfully we were recording a lot of what we were doing because it all just seemed to gel. It was spontaneous, and we weren't necessarily concerned about how to play it live or if it was practical to play live. And Believo wasn't a very practical record to perform live. So there were many tunings, and so I quickly learned when we started playing out, okay, now I have to have like 3 guitars, which I did not like. Immediately I was like, this is a pain in the ass. But, we figured out a way to make that work and to supplement it. And at the time too, we were also being very much, when we were the original Enon 3-piece, we didn't have a bass player, and we were like, we'll have bass frequencies. Well, we won't have a bass player. And we'll make it work, and it's going to be great.
Yep.
And eventually it was like, it might be nice to have a bass player. So that entered Toko Yasuda.
I was going to say, and so the genealogy of Enon, so Rick Lee leaves kind of after Believo. Is that right?
He was going through a pretty crazy time. He was in like 3 or 4 bands. He was playing Butter 08 / doing some shows with Chiba Mato.
Right.
When they needed an extra person. And he also, the Butter 08 band, which Russell Simmons, the drummer for the Blues Explosion, he had a thing on Grand Royal. He put out a record.
Right.
And Rick played in that band. He was a very, very busy man. I was jealous of Rick Lee back then. He was doing work. He had tons of freelance work. You would hear his sound bites on like MTV2. Like he did a lot of their little commercials.
And you would
stuff.
know it was him. Like I remember Skeleton Key going, "Oh yeah, no, that's definitely a Rick Lee thing."
No, totally, yeah. It was very, very particular. His palette of sounds he used. It's in a way one of my greatest regrets because I really felt like he was such an integral part of that band, but he was such a pain in the ass at the time. Like he was really not able to keep his schedule. He was playing more music than anyone else, but he was not very responsible about his schedule. And so I remember we showed up at our practice space to load out for a gig that was that night. And he was there already, and he was surprised to see us. He's like, he thought the gig was the day after, and so he thought he was getting there. He was going to pack up his stuff and, like be ready in advance. And little did he know the gig was that night. So we were like, oof. He also had some other gig that was sort of like, he had screwed up a few times basically with the scheduling part. And, we basically had to kick him out of the band. And I feel like in a way he was being maybe kind of self-destructive at the time in that way. He didn't want to necessarily give up any of them, but he also was kind of like maybe exhausting himself. And so he kind of stopped playing music after that for a while, after he finished the Russell thing. And I think he did like a stint in Speedball Baby playing bass and, for a tour or something. And then he left the stage for like over 10 years. It wasn't until I hooked up with him back in LA that he started like really playing again.
I was going to say, because like, I love Crooks on Tape. It almost really, you were right. It sounds like the continuation of that first iteration of Enon. But I think I read the thing was you guys are improvisational, right?
Yeah. So that's sort of the conundrum of the band. We are always recording.
Mm-hmm.
Once we made a record, you have to go on tour you play shows to support the thing. But so then became the thing where we had to figure out a way to present the record, and that's not improvising.
Right.
And so we kind of got in the spot where it was like, okay, we have to figure out how to play these songs, and which we did. And kind of after we did like a tour or two, and I had the vertical scratcher stuff, when we came back around, back into our sweet spot, it's been both. I mean, it's been the story of the band, but it's also kind of been like the detriment of our thing live. I think right now we're in a better spot where we kind of like to play a half and half when we play live. So it's, bring like 3 or 4 songs to the table, but we'll switch back and forth between a totally improvised thing, find a way to segue out of that, play a song to reel in people so they're like, oh, this is like it's structured, this is like a proper song, and then kind of segue back into that other stuff. So it's kind of a push and pull. A lot of people are necessarily interested in improvisational music, nor is it always captivating. So that's kind of the challenge.
But I love that you pepper it. You peppering it with tethers of actual structure, but allowing yourself to have fun too.
We make up names for these sessions, and before the idea was like, okay, there's some of the stuff gets extracted, like there's nuggets, and you extract the nugget and you turn it into a song, and that's what happened with Fingerprint. Basically, we massaged these improvisations and sort of like little flurries into a proper pop record. That was the idea. That's not always possible. And as we started to do this more and more and more, I started noticing it was like, well, okay, like before it was like nuggets. You'd find really good nuggets.
Right.
And then we started getting really good at transitioning. You'd be like, okay, we've been doing this for a while. Someone would stop, and the other two we would start to like, morph what we were doing until we were able to segue. And so I started noticing like, okay, this part's kind of lame. We started just cutting out parts, basically. Now we're just editing some parts out that aren't as exciting. And before, in the beginning, like I said, it was about trying to form songs. But now I feel like they're cohesive enough that these kind of evenings can exist on their own. We just kind of need to time it down so it's not the newest Tarantino movie or whatever.
Right. But letting them breathe in public a bit too, it's a really good idea. I have a sub podcast thing called Audiomancy where I kind of share all of the weird audio experiments I do, and I've always been fascinated in like seeing what other musicians' processes are, and like their creation and their generation of their music. And I would sign me up, man. I'm first in line for that.
Well, I just feel bad because I feel like we've been together since 2010, and we have 2 official records out.
Right.
But there are we get together sometimes twice a week and slowly going through and digging out the nuggets or just cutting out the fat, basically. And so it's ridiculous that we've been so active and yet we've released so little material. I mean, coming from a world where I've always had like a booking agent to get shows and stuff like that, but I'm barely playing music. It's totally insane. Like I'm barely playing live, which is what I really like to do. I love touring and I love traveling, and a lot of people aren't very suited for it. There are a lot of musicians who hate being away from home. They don't like traveling. They don't like being away from their family if they've started one, and it's very hard on them. But it's like, it's kind of the place I feel most comfortable. Like, is when I go on tour. I feel at ease when I go on tour.
Well, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of that second generation of Enon. High Society was one of my favorite records as well from you guys. Talk about a concept record. Like, that one flows so beautifully in so many different directions for me. But I was wondering if you could talk about just a little bit about, that kind of that era with Toko and maybe the Disillusion a little bit.
Well, Rick Lee's presence in the band still carries over from he wasn't very physically present during the High Society, like basic tracking he was, but he was playing in other outfits during like a lot of the overdubs and stuff for that record.
Okay, so
but
he was still involved.
He is involved on that record, and when we made the Lost Marbles and Exploded Evidence thing, basically it took a long time for High Society was supposed to be the second record on the See-Through Broadcasting label, and literally, I'm telling you, like 3 weeks before the release date of the record is when the label basically was like they were not telling us anything, and then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, the label's folding. And so it was just like, oh, okay, so our record's not coming out in 3 weeks. Like, that record was supposed to be a pre-9/11 record, but it became a post-9/11 record. And
crazy.
I stress that because I feel like that record has a lot to do with Giuliani's pre-9/11 New York. And in it coming out like after that, 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden everything was about rock and roll and slightly more retro. Whereas kind of in my mind, I felt like, 1999, the year 2000, like we're building toward the future. And that next year is 2001.
Well, you guys ended up on Touch and Go, right?
Exactly. And so it took a while to get the rights to that record.
Wow.
And so during that time period when we were waiting for that to happen, we just started releasing a lot of like 7-inches and putting songs on compilations. And that's what became the Lost Marbles and Exploded Evidence sort of compilation, which I consider to be kind of a proper record. But Rick Lee's all over that too.
It's a great record.
There's tons of things on there that he was a part of. So
I think you guys were kind of marketing it as like a B-sides or like rarities kind of thing, right?
Well, I feel like Touch and Go, by the time we had done High Society and then Hocus Pocus, I just felt like there was a lot of good material that people hadn't heard. Like there was probably 2.5 albums worth of material or so, and so I felt like, tapes. You know what?
Release the tapes.
Yeah, it was like we should make a record. We could make definitely a really good proper record out of this stuff, and that's how I was approaching it. But I'm really proud of that record. I like the way it flows better than some records that you just write properly on their own.
I mean, I think of it as a proper Enon record.
Thank you.
I mean, also the DVD was so much fun because I remember Enon.tv, I remember watching like the Carbonation video on, my shitty computer back in the day. And it was like, man, more of this. Where are the visuals? So that was great.
Yeah, it was super fun to make that stuff.
So Hocus Pocus seemed like that was... I saw like production quality kind of go up in the video range, and not that it needed to go up anywhere else or it needed to go there. I remember watching music videos for Hocus Pocus for singles and being like, oh shit, like this looks like, it seemed like there was a lot more money put behind you guys on Hocus Pocus, and it seemed like you guys are kind of poised to you guys are touring all the time. I saw you guys I think twice on that tour. It was fucking great. But what kind of went down around that record? Was that kind of the record that they were pushing you?
But part of what you're seeing visually is actually Juan Monasterio.
Because the bassist, for Brainiac. Yeah.
He started a production company with some guys, and they were making great videos for people. And basically he, the video for In the City, for instance,
yes,
was done by his company.
It's a beautiful video. Yeah, good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then the song "Daughter in the House of Fools" off Hocus Pocus, he also did that video.
Yeah. That one, that's the one I kind of think of in my mind's eye when I'm like, oh shit, Enon's about to take over the world. You know what I mean? Like, it seemed like
that's funny,
poised to be. You guys were, gonna be finally getting the kind of big, recognition. It just seemed like a good push in that direction. What I wanted to get into was Glass Clouds. Yes. I want to get into that record and kind of the end of the chapter for Enon.
Yeah. By the time we got around to doing Grass Geysers, it was decidedly like, in my mind, I didn't think that I would make any more rock records, but I was like, I want to make one more really strong rock record. Little did I know I would do Vertical Scratchers
right
several years later, but that was kind of what I was going for. And Joko and I had moved to Philadelphia, and I was doing a lot more recording. I was recording other bands, so I had like a studio in the house that we lived in, and I'm really proud of that record, the way it sounds sonically. I'm really excited about the whole process. We did basics on tape with Nicholas Vernes, the Rare Book Room in Brooklyn, and then I brought it to my house and did overdubs, and then we brought it back to his place to mix, and then we had it mastered with this guy, Kevorkian Mastering, who also mastered Believo, actually. And I attended that mastering, and I feel like there's been a few times that I've been places that people have like played songs off of that record. Like I've been somewhere and someone was DJing and they played like one of those songs came on before or after, something else. And I was like, oh, that sounds good. Like I still am happy. I'm still happy with the way that came out and seeing that through from, just from a standpoint of like being involved in the recording and in the songwriting of it.
Yeah, Grass Geysers was a cool record, and it sounds like you guys toured kind of nonstop for it, right?
Well, it was a bit of a confuser because at that point, moving to Philadelphia, for me was sort of, in my mind, I was just thinking like, it's really hard to be in a band in New York City. I can't believe that we were able to do it the way we were able to do it for as long as we were. We had a practice space that cost $500 a month. We had van payments that were $500 a month. And then we had our regular like rents, which,
yeah,
it's a lot of money to have to like figure out how to make and go on tour. Like it seems insurmountable to me now.
Yeah.
To be able to do that. So moving to Philadelphia, in a way, for me, I was like, I want to have space. I'm sick of everything that is annoying about New York. And it was getting really annoying, like parking a van anywhere, doing anything anywhere, having a practice space, competing for space. So I felt like I was returning to sort of an East Coast style version of Dayton, Ohio, where I can play in my house in the comfort of my own home again. I can afford to have studio equipment now and maybe record other things. I was doing more freelance music production stuff for like Independent Film Channel and other stuff. And, but for Matt, our drummer, I feel like he saw us moving to Philadelphia as like us moving away from him in a way. And so he started playing with other bands, and he played in a few different things, but he was also playing with this band, Holy Fuck. And at that time, their first record came out, and they were blowing up.
They were big shit.
It was, it was in the middle of that tour, though, so he basically kind of like jumped ship sort of like with some tours looming. So we kind of picked up the pieces and got a drummer we really liked from this guy, Andy Robillard from Go 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 Earhart.
Oh, so Michael Vermillion, Go Go Earhart was like, I went to high school in Southern California, and they were like one of my favorite bands. Used to go see all the time.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well, that's crazy to say, because I have to say that, Mike's a good friend of mine now.
Really?
And
that's awesome.
We played shows with those guys, and, Andy was a real funny guy to have on tour with us, but it was also just kind of like a little bit traumatic because we weren't really expecting that to be part of the, of the situation.
Sure.
Sort of like, I think also building up to that, I had been pushing to try and be a 4-piece here and there. So we kept trying out people. You could tell, even if I was remotely excited about it, I could tell that like they were not that interested in trying to introduce someone who, it's hard to introduce a new person into a band's marriage,
right.
that you have. So it was already complicated there. And you end up spending time like rehearsing with this other person that either does or doesn't end up being your band. So you kind of waste time in a way doing that. And then by the time we did those tours and it was like, okay, Matt's leaving and we needed to find someone to do it, then you have to practice with another person, relearn these things.
Yeah.
It definitely burnt Toko out. And, as much as I think that record is like really a great record and maybe underrated on our catalog, like, there wasn't a lot of excitement around it. And so if Toko hadn't really, said these things to me, I probably would have wanted to continue soldiering on. But it was also very of the times where, by the time 2007 hit 2008 and the economy crashed, that really like affected our lives individually too. So I was like courageously going into more credit card debt in order to like fund tours and do things, and freelance jobs stopped kind of coming. We're living in Philadelphia versus New York, which was financially helpful, but like not on a level of like when things get tight, and they got tight for grandmas,
right.
because, that lost their pensions or whatever because of Bernie Madoff. Like, you're going to hire grandma to do the small jobs.
Absolutely.
And not John Schmersal locally. So, basically that's when the Caribou gig happened for me.
Is that what brought you to LA? Was Caribou?
The band's based in London. And the band's based all over the place. At the time, the guitar player Ryan lived in Singapore.
That's easy.
The drummer Brad lives in Toronto. So it was like, I could have stayed in Philadelphia. I could have gone anywhere, really. We had more friends in Los Angeles, and, we decided to take a chance. And, of course, Rick Lee lived here, too. So as soon as I got here, we started playing music again, which was great. So.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love that you're located in LA. I'm down there more than I am anywhere else, I think. So. Well,
to tell you the truth, I don't know if I began this conversation with this or not, but I've recently moved to the desert.
Oh, where?
I live in Desert Hot Springs.
Nice. So Eastern California a bit?
Well, it's still Southern California, I guess.
Well, I mean,
like
Southeastern.
It's not the Southern California that other people think of.
Sure,
it's funny because everyone, there's a lot of people migrating here from either SF or LA, but most of them moved to Joshua Tree. And I have nothing against Joshua Tree or, like people that are like, it's great, I've got like 20 acres. And I'm like, yeah, but I still have a feeling about like, the consideration to move to the desert for me was more like I wanted to have sort of that thing again I was talking about, like being in a city like Dayton, Ohio, or Philadelphia at that time, where I just wanted to have more space and not be so stressed out about money or people or gentrification or, you know, all of those things. I've just been, you know, like living in big cities is like, there's, you know, there's obviously trade-offs involved, but I want to get back to the center of being able to be creative and be bored enough to like really create with no other incentive than my own.
This is crazy, man. I haven't announced this. You know, I'm a desert rat, like we were talking earlier. I'm from New Mexico and Arizona. But
it's funny because I often don't really think of Albuquerque in a strange way, but I don't often think of it as the desert necessarily, even though it obviously like is, you know.
Yeah.
It is.
That's fair, though. That's fair. I think about Albuquerque in a strange way, too. You know? But
it's a beautiful place. It's been a very strange, like, journey touring there over all of these years. I've had some very special experiences in Albuquerque. But it's a weird city, for sure.
Yeah. But the thing is that, so I've been living in Portland for, like, the last 7 years. And it's time to go. You know, it's time to
yeah, you feeling it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been feeling it for a while. Only place I ever moved back to. So this is like my second time living in Portland, which is super weird for me. But we just found out, due to my girlfriend's job and, you know, I've got family out there, we're going to go to Denver. So
nice. I think Denver's great, man.
Yeah, so that's going to happen real soon. I haven't really talked about it with much people because it's like we can't really fathom it yet, even though it's happening in a month and a half or so.
I mean, Denver was bandied about a little bit. I think I'm just kind of like, I think that I could live many places. I'm pretty adaptable. As long as I have like a figure to be able to still travel, like I really do love touring. Like I still just imagine that no matter where I move, what makes it possible for me to like exist there would be that I'm going to be able to travel. And part of that is that to enable that travel, you know?
Yeah. That's where I'm at as well. You know, like you were talking
but
about.
I've always loved Denver. It's weird, it's also a weird city with weird histories, but there's something very like, it's like Detroit for me. There's something very salt of the earth.
Yeah, very
it.
American in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know. If I had my choice, it wouldn't be Denver proper because I feel like you. I'm like I want to live in the woods. I've taught outdoor schools for a while. Like I kind of would just, I would love a desert setting too. I would just love to be kind of in the shadow of a city, not necessarily in a city, but somewhere where it's more nature based. Just because I think, it would give me way more impetus and like intent to go, do things or be a part of everything.
It's funny because like I remember back in Brainiac, you'd have a cassette deck in the van.
Yeah.
And, but otherwise it was radio. And whenever Juan drove, he actually, like I would be in the loft napping. I would wake up and if Juan was driving, he would be listening to like AM radio, which even then, that was like the birth of like what is now totally conservative style Rush Limbaugh, and whatever that other Alex Jones style, like fucking angry right wing talk radio. That stuff has been going on for a long time, and I was like, Juan, what the fuck are you listening to? Why are you listening to this? And he's like, you gotta know how, like you.
Yeah.
This is
know thy enemy.
Also educational.
Yeah. Know thy enemy. That's what my dad used to say, But so yeah, man, thank you so much for taking this time. This is so illuminating. I really appreciate you and your work, sir. I really do.
Well, I hope that your battery hasn't run out, or your or the terabyte of hard drive space that you had at 96. No.
I keep that shit low just in case.
Nice.
So I really appreciated this.
What I've been illuminated by is I'm really happy that you brought up that you're a fan of Go 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 Earhart / Michael Vermillion.
Oh yes, yeah, man. Yeah. Wow. Jesus, this is why I do this. Thank you so much to John Schmersal for, talking to me for so long and such a wonderful conversation. We did edit it down again, and it was great to work with him on it. You can listen to the full unedited one at patreon.com/WeTheHallowed. You heard it first in this. If you're still listening, I revealed that Denver is on the horizon. The Weirdo Podcast Triangle will now stretch out to the southwest. It's looking like October. I will devote an entire episode to keeping you updated on the move. It's a good one. It's for great reasons. And I talked to next week's episode, Derek Hunter, in depth about it. We actually have a great dialogue about it. So you'll hear more on that soon. The episode art was conjured by the Disruption Generator by Outlet Press, Eric Millar. You can pick up a soft cover on Amazon still, disruptiongenerator.com. The card was geometric. And let's see. Again, thank you so much for listening. I know I've been on kind of a break. Life has been insane. It's been beautiful, but insane. I can't be more excited for the future. I can't wait to share more. But I'll just leave it at that for now. Once again, visit WeTheHallowed.org, our art collective, for articles, all that good stuff. The music was Matters Gray by Enon as the first track, and the song behind me is also by John. It's Crooks on Tape, and the song is called If Feelings Mean a Thing. Theme music was by Dakota Slim. Please check out Cactus Crown. It's my album. Owes a lot to John. That's been out for a year now. DakotaSlim.net. Before I leave you, I'd like to play one more track from John. It's from his solo record he created in the Masonic Temple under the name John Stuart Mill. It's called Refresh the Anchor. I love you all. Thank you very much. And haunt on.
I heard about your friend through the dead by dead moon. Just thought I should refresh the anchor for